So, why this talk? I started out my career in a localization company, moved to another one. So my first 10 years of professional software development was in the localization industry. I was quite surprised when I left the localization industry and went into normal software development, how little people knew about localizing software and the internationalization of software. There's two guys sitting there that I went to work with. This isn't picking on you. um, because every other company I've gone to as well has had these problems. So I thought it was kind of good to go through some of this stuff. I also think that as software developers, we kind of focus a bit on the new and shiny and we forget about the basics. And this is kind of going back to kind of what .NET is about, how it handles some very basic stuff without anything fancy. So what's the difference between internationalization and localization? They're kind of the opposite sides of the same coin. But to talk about internationalization, we really need to focus on localization first. So first thing you'll notice is the localization industry loves these numeric reductions. So it's L10N, it's not localization. You'll see this quite a lot because apparently it's quicker to say L10N. So localization, most people kind of think of it as translation, and that's part of it, but it's not actually the whole of it. Translation is a very, very small part of it, particularly in software. That's the minimum requirements. Localization, the actual definition of it is adapting your software to suit a cultural region or language. So language is the translation part, but you have to consider the region and the culture as well. So you might be thinking, well, what's the difference between those two things? If you think about it in terms of maybe an American sports website, you would have American footballers, hockey players, baseball players on the main screen. That would mean nothing to somebody here unless you're a big fan of American sports. You'd want to see a football player or a rugby player or something like that. That would mean a lot more to you. Another example is Peppa Pig. So British TV program aired in Australia that said that spiders don't hurt you. Further on down in this article, I didn't want to show this because, you know, some fragile minds. They have a huntsman spider carrying a mouse up the side of a fridge in Australia. And this episode was recommending that children sleep with their spiders and play with them and all that kind of stuff. So this is the kind of problem that you can get into with poor localization that is not language related. So then what is internationalization? So said that you kind of need to talk about localization first. Internationalization, I18N, is preparing your software for localization. So it's getting rid of all the cultural specifics that you have in your software. So that's cultural assumptions that you've made, date time, language, and all that kind of stuff. So it's neutralizing your software from a cultural perspective. So then we have globalization, which is actually just both terms put together. But I wanted to keep this talk internationalization, localization, to make Kevin say more things and have trouble with his tweets. So, and that is G11N, just for keeping everything. So you're kind of thinking, I'm software developers, I don't really care what happens around the rest of the world. This doesn't affect me. And I want to show you that actually it does, because some of these things cause problems. That is, hopefully, I'm going to show you that it does. So for the first demo, I've got a very simple application. It's WPF, but that's not really relevant. I just didn't want to get into any complicated cloudy stuff. Or, whoa. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to see that all right. So, you can pretty much ignore this. I'll talk about this later. This is actually a bug in WPF, which is quite annoying. Main window, I'm setting a prices view model. In that, loading a command, load prices, and further down here. So I'm loading shop items.xml from resources, iterating over that, parsing the price, name, price, quantity, and use by date, and adding it to my shop items, which is bound to Hopefully it won't take a long time though. There we go. The first time that this has been loaded on this machine. So you can see we've got a form, we're just loading prices. This is a very simple shop scenario. And our data is bound down here in the grid. So if I run this, we get our shop, and I can click load prices. And we get bread, milk, and a jumbo croissant, because who wants a normal one? And prices, quantity, and the use by dates. So I can break this application without making any compiler changes. All I'm going to do is find the right setting, which has been really reduced. And I'm going to be a French user, I think. So I don't have to be in France. Just be a standard French person, because they always break stuff. And I've actually lost. Wow, this resolution's really... There we go. So I could be a French person living in the UK, and I want to load prices, and boom, doesn't work. So you get this exception. It's not even a nice break, it's just a crash. So what happens if I'm an American? Some of you, I'm sure, have got very good hints on what's going on here. I am just stalling so that we wait for the pizza to come, by the way. Outlying islands, no. Proper American. And we load prices, and use by dates are wrong. So now they're all expiring all over the place. And this is happening because in my shop items, oops. First of all, my dates are UK format, and my currency uses a dot separator. And in France, they use a comma. So when it tries to parse this, it's expecting 1,7 instead of 1.7, and it's crashing. And in the US, this is April, because they do things back to front. So how do we fix that? Well, if you're Blue Peter, you have UModel 2. And I think this is quite a bad bug in .NET, really. I think it's a design decision that was done wrongly, really. It's not very many, but there's a few. And what you have to do here is rather annoying. Double dot parse, dot value, then pass in system globalization, cultural info, invariant culture. Really nice and short, so that you're always parsing the invariant culture. Because our date time is a GB, ENGB date culture, I intentionally did that to show you how you specifically call a culture that you want to map to. So you can get a specific culture if you want to and parse that. There is a much easier way to do this, which I'll show in a later demo if I remember. But I thought there might be some people that were saying that I should be using decimal for money anyway. But I've commented this out to show that actually it's exactly the same. You get the same problem. So, lessons. .NET doesn't handle this very well. Should always use invariant culture, and it's not just parsing, it's when you're writing as well. If you do toString, so if you do toString on a server, it's picked up by a client, and your server is in a different country or a different culture, your code may break. And there are some globalization rules that you can set for this, which I can show you in here. At really high resolution. Can't get the menu to pop up. In your project settings, code analysis, there's this enable code analysis on build, and if you select Microsoft globalization rules, that will throw warnings to tell you that you've done something wrong there and you're quite dangerous on another culture. I'm not going to enable that because it may take away from the rest of my demo a bit if you get spoilers. So that's the first bit. I probably should have shown you run it actually, shouldn't I? Rather than take my word for it. This is where the proof's in the pudding, really. So if I change to view model 2 here, my code behind, and just run this. As an American, we get 4th of October, 6th of October, 3rd of October, and as a French person, it will work. You can become French again if you want. This is taking a bit longer because the resolution's a bit strange. So, that works. But it's all in English. The languages are still all hard-coded, so we're not really culturally neutral. So what we need to bring in is resource management, and that's .NET's way of taking your culture and neutralizing it by using a resource manager. It will automatically map variables to the current culture for you. It works in this kind of hierarchical system. You specify a default resource type. Usually people go for ENUS, but here you could go for ENGB if you wanted to. And then you get more specific as you go down. .NET works on language and culture as they treat it as two different things. So you can say you want to have your default in one language, then you want to get more specific with EN, and even more specific again with certain things that are particular to ENUS or ENGB. You could have other variations as well in there. So you'll see some crossover, so you would have ENCA, but you've also got FRCA for French Canadians. What this means is that if you want to say something specific for ENUS, you only have to do it for those things that are particular to the ENUS culture. So you can keep all your base. So if you, for example, if you wanted all the strings with a U in the color to be in your base EN because you're EN British, then you put all the ones without the U in the ENUS and everything else will just flow up the system. Also means if you forget to translate something, it'll just appear in English in your base language rather than throwing an exception. So how do we actually do that in practice for a more global application? We're still running. So I've got a second demo here where I've separated all of the strings out into resources here, not here, in here. So I've got, if you can see this okay, it's a little bit fuzzy for me. I've got the base resources at the bottom, and then we've got French, we've got FRCA and ENUS as well. And I'm loading those in the main window XAML by referencing the namespace as a resources namespace, so demo2.properties, and then throughout the rest of the XAML calling this resources static main title. So if I have a look at what that main title is in the resources file, that just maps to my international shop. So you can see I've done this for all of the column titles and buttons and things like that. This price call has a price in pounds. If I go to ENUS, I've just overwritten that effectively with price in dollars, and it's the same in French. I have Google translated these, so they may not be perfect French, but we've got the price in euros and then the price in dollars if we go to dollars. And that means that hopefully this system's still in French. If I run demo 2, we actually get a localized application into probably quite poor French. So, and that's been done just because my system's now in French. It will recognize that and load it in from the resource manager. So if I switched to, so we've got this euro. If I switch to Canadian, we get a dollar there. If I switch to ENUS, we get a dollar and different date formats. But we're still not perfect here because all the items have come up as bread, milk. They're all still in English. Although we said that the price is in euro, we're actually charging the price in pounds. And yeah, if we look at how we're parsing this, we are still in the view model, we're still parsing the ENGB date format. So we're still doing this as the ENGB culture. By the way, this is the nicer way to parse a double and a date time as well if you've got it in the right format. This will do the right thing. X.to-link will take the value, parse it in invariant culture and return you the correct double. So that's a much nicer way to do this. So moving on to the data, some rules around data which I'm hoping that you're familiar with. So always store your measurements in SI units. Don't pick a funny unit or a local unit and store them. So please don't use feet and miles. Try and use SI units. It keeps your head straight and you know exactly what you've got in your database. Same thing for dates. Use ISO 8601 and a UTC time zone. .NET will put the time, ISO 8601 will put the time offset at the end. That Z at the end means it's in UTC, but otherwise you get +1, +5, that kind of thing. So .NET will parse that correctly. But if you're trying to figure out what's gone wrong in a database and you've got multiple time zones and you don't know what time anything's happened in, you're making life really, really hard for yourself. Where there isn't a global standard like money, then just pick a base and stick to it. You could argue that money as a base is US dollars, but really that depends on the country that you're working in, what you're converting from and to. And if you can, create value classes to manage the data structures properly so that you don't accidentally get the wrong data type out. The golden rule of all of this is store it in a global format and display it in the local format. So we're going to change the application to do a little bit of this. And that is demo 3. And I have changed I've changed this XML file slightly so that now we have item bread. Price is still the same, and our date format is this is ISO 8601. So you notice this maps to resources in the resource file, which I have added here. So I've got item bread, and we can load that in the view model. Also notice this, we'll come back to this later. I've no longer got the US and Canadian resources in here. I've ditched those, and I will inject the currency in here. The other thing to note actually in this resources is that you don't just have to store strings, you can store files. So I've got my shop items in there as the resource file. This is really handy if your data, unlike this, if your data is very dependent on the locale. A nice thing to do is to put all of the data in as files, in your multiple resources. You can name them here as you have here, so you could have resources where you've got resource.fr, you have shop items.fr.xml. In here you can rename it so that when you call that resource it's got the same name, and that'll automatically load your other data type. How does the prices view model look now that we've done that? We are parsing as a string stream directly from the resources, and we can do all this much nicer, easier reading of the XML. To get the localized names, I'm calling the resource manager getString, so you can pass in the name of the resource that you want by accessing the resource manager directly. The other thing we've done here is created this currency object. So this is the value classes I was talking about. That takes value in GBP, and when you ask for it, it takes, I really don't advise you do this because you could end up just offering the wrong currency to something, but for other things it works quite nicely. So I'm taking the region info from the thread, getting the currency format from that, get the ISO currency symbol, which I have mapped to enum up here, so we've got the 4 currencies that we support. Parsing that enum, and then we get value and convert that from the GBP to the current format. And I didn't want to use an internet connection, so this is a great way to do this, by the way, but I think pretty much you could just multiply it by 1 these days, couldn't you, for euro. So this will take our currency, convert it to the right currency based on where you are. We also can display the correct currency symbol by doing culture info number format currency symbol. And if you want to be really daring, you can do the value toString with a C, and that will display the currency with the right currency symbol in the place that that person from that country will expect it. But if you didn't support that currency, then you may be offering it up in a currency that isn't correct again. So let's see that all working. Or not. Running somewhere else? Okay. So now we get our items localized, so they're translated correctly. They're localized into the correct price with the euro. This is the, if you do the C on the toString, the value, you get this 125 euro. And we've got everything localized nicely. So this is a fully localized application, or globalized application, you could say. So this is proving that the internationalization of your software is correct, really. If I was to go back and be, so I could be Canadian. If I find Canada. So I'm French Canadian now. This is totally messing up your machine, Kevin, sorry. So now we've got dollars, and if I do that, we get 282 in dollars. And this is the way the Canadians expect to see their dollars, or French Canadians do, apparently. So this is all leveraging Microsoft and .NET. So I'm not doing anything myself here. Now we've done that. Talk a little bit about the translation process, because I think sometimes people can get a bit mixed up about what they actually need to provide and what they should get back. So You provide your source files, which is your regex files that we had there. You don't provide the target files. Please don't try and do any translation yourself or provide the previous translations because they're useless to translator. You only need to provide the source files. Give them to a project manager who will farm them out to multiple translators. Very important if you're using a proper LSP, but the translator is a native of the target language. They will never be a native of your language. So that's why if you were translating into 5 languages, you would expect it to go to 5 different translators. It should be somebody who grew up in that country and has been imported, so they're an immigrant. It's one of those jobs that locals can't do, not properly. You have to have experience. And the companies actually will normally pay for those people to go back home as well and get familiarize themselves again with their modern phrases and that kind of thing. So a translator will start with their source file, translate that into the target file using specialist software. That uses translation memory and terminology database. Translation memory is basically like a dictionary lookup effectively that works on sentences, but it's a lot smarter than that. It'll do context related searches based on your previous and next sentences, the format of the original format of the document. It'll swap out currency, numbers, all that kind of stuff, and treat those as separate things. So this is a lot more powerful than what you could ever do if you tried to pre-translate it with Google Translate or something like that. Terminology, think of it as a thesaurus for multiple languages. So they get like it's key information that you've got about your company and what that means in different languages, the context and all that kind of stuff. Optional phase, which is usually a bit expensive, so most companies ignore this, is a back translation, where once the translator has translated into the target language, it goes back to a native speaker in the original languages who translates it back, and then they compare it side by side to see whether they've both understood the context correctly and what's being translated. That is usually a fair bit more expensive and is reserved for things like nuclear manuals and that kind of thing, where you really, really don't want to get it wrong. You get back the target file, and then you'll be asked to integrate that in your software and preferably give them a copy of the software with instructions on how to access all the strings. Most times that ends up in a demo and they realize that they've maybe misunderstood a phrase or got something wrong, or what they're trying to translate it into, especially if it's like German, is far too long for the little box that you were trying to fit it into, and it's just your dialog box goes like this. And then that'll go round a few more reviews and that kind of stage. So that's what's happening under the hood. There's a lot of other stuff that would happen if you had a lot of images or that kind of things that aren't really related to software. So you'd have graphics designers, and the project manager would have to do a lot more work for it. So software terms, they quite like doing software because it's simple strings, it's context free effectively most of the time, and it's fairly straightforward. There's no kind of fancy graphics or anything. They get it in a nice regex file that is easy. The software will parse that quite easily. If you use a cheap localization service provider, or you don't do this properly, these are some of the examples of things that you can get. Most of these were found in UK or US restaurants. Some final tips, because I think the pizza's going to be arriving soon. Try to provide full sentences in your resources where possible. If you provide the first part of that, put your variable in and then provide the second string as on a separate line. The translator can't really work with that. They can't provide a good translation. If you provide the whole sentence and insert the variables in the middle, they can ignore those and shift the sentence around it. Be aware that the dollar notation for strings isn't localizable. You should only use that for log files and debugging, which brings me on to the next point of don't localize your log files, because you don't need them localized. It's expensive and you won't be able to read it. Last point there is beware the German Exit. This character, for those who haven't come across it, actually means double S in German. It's an S sound. There's no capitalization of that symbol. It's one of the only symbols I know of that doesn't have a capitalized version. So if you call string to upper, you will get that character back. Then if you do char is upper, you'll get false. It'll still be a lowercase letter. The correct capitalization of that is double S, because there's no symbol for this. So it's effectively two capitalized S's. For reasons that Eric Lippert went into in a really long blog post, this is by design in .NET. They can't extend the length of a string when you call to upper. If you want to read it, go search for that blog post. Good news is, for those who've been wondering, Turkish I does work correctly. There are two Turkish I's, one with a dot and one without a dot. If you capitalize the one with a dot, then you should get a capital I with a dot on top. If you're in a Turkish locale, you will get that. If you're Turkish, I'm sure you understand what the differences are. Some things that I didn't put on here that you should not do, which I was thinking about today when I was debugging some code and trying to figure out what was going on. Please don't tell the user just to change their system locale to English. They don't like that. It's not a solution. Don't put the EN-US culture at the top of every file to ensure that the culture that the thread's running in is the EN-US culture, because that is a bit of a hack as well. I've seen all kinds of really horrible variations on this of people trying to get around the issues without really understanding it, and at the end of it you're going to miss it somewhere, so you're better just doing it properly. And that's it from me. Okay.